Hey, it's Clayton. Welcome to howtodrawcomics.net. Sizing up your characters so that they look right is one of the core challenges that we all struggle with. And it all comes down to the underlying structure that holds up the human figure. That means we've got to start out with a powerful foundation to build our characters upon. So in this lesson, you're going to learn how to draw your comic book characters in proportion. I'm going to teach you exactly what proportions are and how you can use them as a tool to size up your characters and construct them correctly. You'll find a link to the free ebook in the description below this video, the proportions template for the heroic figure, and a link to the full extended 1-hour edition of this lesson. I hope you enjoy it. Here you can see a lineup of 4 comic book superheroes. At a glance, they might look as though they're drawn fairly well. They're all wearing costumes that look pretty cool, and for the most part, their anatomy is all placed together in the right order. They're also packed with loads of detail and intricate rendering. And of course, on a technical level, they've been refined with carefully weighted line work. And as a whole, you could call these characters well drawn. But if you look carefully, you might also see that something's just a little bit off about them. They don't quite look right. Why is that? Well, the reason is, although I've decorated them with loads of detail, they haven't been sized up correctly at all. Their proportions are completely wrong. From the left, character number 1's arm is way too big for the rest of his body. Combine that with his stumpy lower legs and he soon starts to look more like a lumbering ape than a superhero. On top of that, his head is slightly too big for the rest of his body, giving him a characterized bobble-headed appearance. Character number 2 has a large head as well, but in this case it doesn't pose too much of a problem, other than the fact it unintentionally makes her look a lot younger than she's supposed to be. What really sticks out here, like a sore thumb, is her freakishly huge Hulk hand. Character 3 has the opposite problem. He'd otherwise be drawn quite well if his head wasn't so small. He's also sporting a bulky gorilla arm, which quite frankly is a few sizes larger than it needs to be. And finally we've got character 4 with her long, elegant legs. Technically her legs are indeed way too long in relation to the rest of her body. Longer legs do however give characters an attractive edge. So depending on style, this look might actually be more desirable for getting characters to exude a little more sex appeal. All 4 of these characters have been drawn noticeably out of proportion, and although in this example I've purposefully not sized them up correctly to make a point, there was once a time when this kind of thing popped up in my drawings constantly. From time to time I still struggle with proportions, and maybe you've faced a similar dilemma when drawing your characters too, where they just don't quite seem to fit together in the right way. Here's why this is one of the most common dilemmas we all face when we start learning how to draw the human figure. From head to toe, every part of our body conforms to a standard set of measurements, according to its height. For the most part, these measurements are the same from person to person, with a few minor differences in between. That's why when our characters aren't drawn in proportion, they usually look strange to us, because they simply veer too far away from the human size ratios we're used to seeing. If you don't know what these anatomical measurements are, there's a good chance your characters might share similar mistakes with the examples in front of you. Scarily, it's easy to miss too. You may not even notice how off the sizing of your character is, until the drawing is completely finished and it's too late. The worst part is, proportions are foundational. That means your ability to size your characters up correctly from the get-go will either make or break them. No amount of carefully placed anatomy, intricate detail, shading, rendering can save a disproportionate drawing from looking plain wrong. In this lesson, you'll learn exactly what proportions are, how you can use them as a tool to size your characters up correctly, and how they can be applied to a variety of unique character types. Proportions refer to the relative measurements of and within an object. In this case, we're talking humanoid characters. So the overall height of the idealized figure as well as its various body parts, such as the torso, arms and legs. Once you know what these measurements are, you'll have a better understanding of how each part of the human body relates to itself in terms of size, even when drawing it in perspective. Ultimately, that means you'll be able to draw each part of your character to the correct size in association to the rest of the body. Of course, there's always going to be exceptions here because no two people are exactly the same. We all come in different shapes and sizes, and this is especially true for the fictional characters you'll create. From dwarfs to giants, there's a wide spectrum of archetypes that could pop up in the pages of your comic book. Even the basic man, woman, and child all differ proportionally. And rest assured, we'll cover some of those differences here a little bit later on. But for now, don't feel overwhelmed. Learning proportions might seem overcomplicated. However, they don't have to be. As soon as you memorize the basic measurements I'm about to show you, you'll realize proportions are really there to serve as a guide, to be kept in mind as you draw, not necessarily a strict set of rules you'll need to abide by every time pencil goes to paper. You can always bend the rules later on to get more unique variations. Best of all, when we do notice our drawings don't quite look correct, the principles of proportion will give us a reference to help us figure out where we've gone wrong so that we can fix the drawing. We'll talk more later about why proportions are more useful when used in this way in dynamic figure drawing. But for now, let's ease into this by breaking down the proportions of one of the most common characters you're likely to draw for a comic book, the heroic figure. Before we jump into it, let's talk about how we're actually going to determine the proportions of our characters. Because if we want to measure them up to the right size, we're going to need a unit of measurement to work with. Luckily for us, the human body is already relatively symmetrical, its measurements mathematically predictable. So without getting too fancy here, we're going to use the head of our character as the measuring stick of choice. That's right, it just so happens the entire human body, along with all its parts, torso and limbs, can be drawn out to the correct size using the head to measure it. That means once you've practiced your proportions enough and you're familiar with them, the size of the head alone will basically allow you to predict how big the rest of the character is going to be on the page. This becomes especially useful for placing them into a scene or composition at the desired size. All we need to know now is how many head units each part of the character should be according to its size. Taking that on board, let's begin by covering the average proportions of the idealized heroic figure. In reality, most people average out at about 7.5 heads high, give or take. Surprisingly though, if you draw your characters to this height, that's kinda how they're going to feel visually, average and somewhat stumpy. This is because over time, different proportions have become associated with different character stereotypes. An example of this would be our tendency to associate size with the amount of power or strength a character possesses. For women, that could very well translate to a long-legged sense of sex appeal, elegance, and presence. This means that although the average height of the characters in front of you is true to reality, the average Joe and Jane just ain't gonna cut it in the leading role of a superhero epic. We're talking about idealized characters existing within the realm of comic books, and within that context, it's usually more ideal to bump our characters up to about 8 heads high for both men and women. The idealized measurements of 8 heads has in fact been around since the Renaissance and is generally accepted by most artists as the proportional standard. Though few people are actually 8 heads tall in real life, this is still the best model to use because it makes the proportional alignments of the human figure much easier to work out. Taking on board these heroic proportions, let's begin by breaking them down, using the character's head to measure the rest of their body segment by segment. Between the top of the head and the bottom of the chin, we get one head unit. Multiply that by 8 and we get the overall height of our character's body. Sometimes the female head can appear slightly bigger than the man's, but don't be tricked. In actual fact, they're both the same size. It's just the broader width of a man's shoulders that makes their head look a little smaller in comparison. Down from the bottom of the chin, about 1/3 of a head, we find the collarbone and shoulders. Now there's a subtle difference here between men and women. Men typically have much broader shoulders, spanning about 2 head lengths wide. Female characters, on the other hand, have narrower shoulders, about 2 head widths, and 1/3 across at their widest point. Combine that with their smaller neck muscles, and this again is what often gives female characters the illusion of having a bigger head. 2 heads down, we find the nipples. On female characters, they might sit slightly lower due to breast mass, but regardless of gender, there'll inevitably be room for variation here where both pecs and boobs are concerned, due to muscle mass, body fat, and breast size. The bottom of the ribs sits 2 heads and 2/3 down. In most other proportional charts, this is usually glossed over, and it's not necessarily important to know. But I think it's worth mentioning here because this marks the beginning of the upper body's transition into the lower half, where the 2 main forms, the rib cage and the pelvis, combine. 3 heads from the top, we've reached the elbows, which is also where you'll find the waist on both characters. In case you're confused about the difference between the waist and the hips, the waist is actually the narrowest point of the torso, just below the ribs but just above the hips. It's the squishy, malleable cylinder of muscle that makes up for a majority of the torso's movement. This is the part of the body where you'll often see the most pinching, twisting, and stretching occur as the figure moves into different positions. On our male character, you'll find his belly button along this division as well. On women, however, the navel actually sits a little bit lower, just below the 3 head mark. Moving onward, I've marked out some of the key forms that make up the shape of the male's obliques and female's hips. Again, these are rarely shown on proportional charts, but I wanted to include them here to give you a more detailed reference to refer to whenever you're in doubt. It can, after all, be a little confusing trying to figure out where the top of the legs begin and the pelvis ends, especially when you're dealing with the overlaying anatomy. 4.5 heads from the top, we've arrived at the midway point of our characters. This is a great marker to keep in mind, especially when drawing your characters to proportion in perspective. There's a few things you'll find along this segment: the crutch, hip joints, and the end of the forearm where the wrists meet the hands. You might notice that the hips on our male figure are slightly smaller than the females, at a width of 1.5 heads wide. This is because women have a much broader pelvic bone designed to help them bear and give birth to children. So as a result, the hips are pushed outward to almost the same width as their shoulders. That's often why the general shape of a male torso can easily be compared to a light bulb, while the female body has more of an hourglass contour. You can also see how the differences in hip width affects their stance. When both feet are together, the woman appears to have a more inward tapered stance, as opposed to the man's, which is only slightly angled. 4.5 heads down, you'll find the base of the hand. Measuring from wrist to fingertip, an outstretched hand should end up resting about midway down the upper leg. While we're on the topic, it's also worth noting that the size of the hand will be around the same size as your character's face. The human body makes proportions easy to learn in that way, where you're often able to use one part of the body to size up another. Dropping down to 5.5 heads, we're at the top of the knee. The entire knee is a whole half a head in length, with the base sitting along the 6th segment. The mistake I always used to make, and one you might want to watch out for, was drawing the knees smack bang along this line. It's important to remember that 6 heads down does not mark the center of the knees, but rather their base. Nearing the end, the ankles are at 7 heads and 2/3 of the way down, and finally, At 8 heads down, we've arrived at the base of the figure. These are the typical proportions I like to use when it comes to drawing heroic characters for comic books. Memorizing them will help you confidently draw your characters to the correct size, and with enough practice, you'll start to get a natural feel for how each part of the body relates to itself in terms of size. Of course, later on, these proportions can be tweaked or modified to your own liking to create the unique variations that your characters will inevitably have. This chart is not the be-all and end-all cookie-cutter solution to sizing up every single character uniformly. Our intention is not to create an army of clones here. It's a starting point, and in fact, these proportions may not be ideal for you in the first place. Maybe you find an average head height of 9 instead of 8 works better for the look and the feel you want your characters to have. Which is totally fine, because as artists, we're all going to bring our unique interpretation of the world and the people within it to the table. So begin with these proportions, memorize and practice them until you understand how the different parts of the body measure up against one another. Then go your own way and explore the endless possibilities. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and give me a shout out in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Also, if you are interested in the full 1-hour edition of this lesson, I'm going to put a link to that in the description below this video. When you get the full 1-hour extended version of the lesson, we'll get in depth into how the proportions we just learned about actually change depending on your character's age, pose, and the perspective you're drawing them in. I'll also give you the lowdown on the proportions of the human head, as well as highlight some of the key size associations throughout the human body to make drawing your characters in proportion second nature. I'm also including a whole bunch of extras to go along with it, including a workshop series. Some of those extras are limited, but again, if you'd like to know more, just hit the link in the description below. Thanks again, and until next time, see you later.